All right, ladies and gentlemen, this video is all about cells. So you've been reading about these for a little while now, but these cells are by definition these tiny little structures that make up all living things. As a side note, that means that the viruses that are making so much news right now, those little virions are not made up of cells. So by definition, they're not even considered alive. All life is by definition made up of these things. And that's everything from a tiny little bacteria all the way up to the largest organisms on Earth. All right, so we've got two different kinds. We've got the plant cells and the animal cells. Now, they're going to look significantly different maybe at first glance, but you'll notice that many of these tiny little organelle parts are going to be very similar between the two. So we're going to take a look at some of those distinct pieces here in just a second. In real life, if you had one of our microscopes in the classroom, the plant cells would look a bit like this onion skin here. So you can see they have that rigid outer shape, and that represents the cell wall, which we'll look at in a moment. And animal cells, like our human skin cells, might be a little bit more blob-like and a little less rigidly defined. All right. So first of all, what is an organelle? Well, these cells are made up of all those little pieces you see in the diagram, and all these little separate membrane-bound pieces are considered organelles. So if you want to look at the grand scale of organization, we are considered an organism, one living thing. But if you consider all of, say, your skeletal system, that's all your bones put together, each individual bone would be considered an organ. And then you might have the hard, solid tissue on the outside of the bone versus the soft, spongy tissue on the inside of the bone. So tissues are just types of cells that make up an organ. And you have multiple different types of cells, so you have multiple tissues. But if you break down the tissue of many cells into one piece, you have a single cell. And then today I'm going to be doing a lot of focus on these organelles, which are those parts of the cell. But even the organelles are made up of proteins, which are then made up of smaller molecules and atoms, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what's a cell wall? A cell wall is these rigid, solid outer edges. They're actually not just limited to plant cells. Fungal cells, like mushrooms, have the same thing. But keep in mind, a fungus is not a plant, nor is it an animal. So it's kind of cell walls are kind of special to just these solid, rigid types of cells. You can see in the diagram here that the cell wall is this big, green, thick outer shell. And it's made up of cellulose, which is something that the human body is not very good at digesting. So if you eat a bunch of corn and you poop it back out and it looks kind of like corn, it's because your body didn't really digest that cell wall very well. All right. The cell membrane. So if the cell wall is this rigid supportive structure that just kind of keeps the cell from bending or flexing or breaking or being damaged, the cell membrane instead actually controls what gets in and out. So this thing, I've heard it compared with a screen door. I like to compare it more with like a sieve here, where certain things can slip through and other things can't get through. And so it's sort of the gate. It guards what's allowed into the cell and what's not allowed in. It controls what gets spit out of the cell and what doesn't get out of the cell. And it's super important for controlling whether enough food and oxygen gets in and whether enough carbon dioxide and other waste gets spit out. Now, inside of the cell, even from these microscope images, you can see there's a big little gray blob or darker blob in there. These blobs, these large dark spots, are the nucleus. It's the largest and most important organelle in the entire cell because it contains the DNA. And if you've heard of DNA, this is the genetic code. It's all the information that helps control not just how the cell functions, but how the cell even knows how to make more cells. So all your traits, all your physical characteristics, your eye color, your hair color, how tall you are, and the structure of even how to make more, say, skin cells, all of that is contained in the DNA. So it's sort of like a library full of information that tells your entire body how to do everything. All right. Well, there's some parts to the nucleus. Inside the nucleus, you have this chromatin. Chromatin is the uncoiled DNA strands. So if you can think of each of these little squiggly lines as being a strip of code or information written on it, that's your DNA. And then the nucleolus. This is a tiny little spot in the center of the nucleus, and its job is to make ribosomes. We'll get to that in a second. Chromatin. So this is the DNA while it's uncoiled. Again, that's these little purple lines. I compare it to an extension cord because when you uncoil it, that's when you're going to be able to use it. An extension cord is not very useful when it's all coiled up. It's not very long. So while your DNA is uncoiled as chromatin here, you won't be used, or you will be able to then use it, and your cell can copy that information and send it off to different parts of the cell. But when your cell is ready to split into multiple cells, it's got to coil all that information up into these X-shaped chromosomes. You may have heard the term chromosome before. And this is how your body then can move that DNA around when it's about to split the cell apart and make more cells. The nucleolus, again, that center part of the cell, is good for making ribosomes. Now, ribosomes are super important because if you remember, I said all these organelles we're talking about today, they're all made with proteins. So proteins are kind of like the building blocks, the Legos that you snap together to make the organelles. And if you have enough organelles, you can make a cell, and cells make tissues. So you need proteins to build all of this stuff up here. Well, to make a protein, you need a ribosome. Ribosomes are like your protein factories. But guess what? How do you get a ribosome? The nucleolus builds them. So the nucleolus here is the factory that makes the ribosomes. The ribosomes are the factories that assemble the proteins. So it's a bit like I think of it like this Batman statue here. It's a Lego sculpture building itself out of Legos, right? The proteins are used to build the nucleolus. The nucleolus builds ribosomes. The ribosomes build proteins. So it's like a Lego printing machine that then is made out of Legos itself and made in another factory that's also built out of Legos. Kind of a ridiculous analogy, but hopefully it helps. So nucleolus builds ribosomes, ribosomes build proteins. Cytoplasm. No pretty picture for this one. Here's why. The cytoplasm is all of this space, all the orange you see that is just kind of in between everything else. And so if you see the little label here, cytoplasm is just pointing at nothing. Yeah, that's why. The cytoplasm is just a clear fluid, mostly water, that just fills in all the empty space of the organelles. If you actually dry out a cell, if you take a skin cell and put it under a hot lamp and let it dry up, it actually looks a lot like a raisin. It just kind of crumples down and shrivels up because you've just cleared out all of that fluid. So it kind of fills up and gives structure to the cell and allows things to move around. The mitochondria, that's this weird bean-shaped thing that often when you see it cut in half, it shows these squiggly patterns in the middle. This is the power plant of the cell. What it does is it takes chemical energy from like sugar that you eat and it burns it. I mean, it chemically reacts it to produce the energy. So you have enormous amounts of mitochondria, say, in your muscle cells, because then they produce all of the energy that your muscles need to move. But you also have mitochondria, say, in your brain cells to generate the energy to send electrical pulses around to the rest of your body. So this is kind of analogous to, say, the nuclear power plant that then just ships out all the energy through wires to the rest of the body. This thing does all the chemical reactions to produce the chemical energy that then powers all the other organelles in your body. All right, the endoplasmic reticulum, this is sometimes just referred to as the ER, but there are two types. There's the rough and the smooth version. The rough version is named the rough version because it's covered in these tiny little spots, and the tiny little spots are ribosomes. What did ribosomes do? They made proteins, right? Well, if you have a bunch of these little protein factories spitting out proteins all the time, but you need to gather a bunch of those little ribosomes together, or those proteins, together inside of the nucleus, then it's kind of handy to have this little conveyor belt that, if you follow it kind of like a maze, this drawing is a little weird, they help transport, just like a conveyor belt in a factory, they help carry all these little protein pieces to the center of the nucleus for assembly into important cell parts. So when we say it's the rough endoplasmic reticulum, what we're saying is it's this weird squiggly chamber covered in the bumps, covered in the ribosomes, that then helps transport those proteins. All right, Golgi apparatus. This is just fun to say since it's got a hard and a soft G in the same word. Golgi apparatus. The purpose of this one is shipping and receiving. Basically, it transports proteins and other chemicals in and out of the cell. It also sends it between different parts of the cell. So if you see these little transport vesicles, this is the incoming one, these are the outgoing ones. And so it's a bit like a warehouse. Proteins wrapped up in this little vesicle will come in, attach itself to the Golgi apparatus. It'll get stored inside of these little pouches, and then it'll get sent out the other side to wherever else it needs to go. So it's like the post office. It just sends and receives materials around the cell. And then we have the vacuole. This one is mostly in just plant cells. So you notice this gigantic vacuole. Well, think about it. If you and I get hungry or thirsty, we just go find food or water, because being animal-like, we have the ability to move about. Plants can't do that. With their roots buried in the ground, they have to just wait for more water to rain out of the sky. They have to wait for a sunny day. So they have to be able to store food and water for whenever they desperately need it, because they don't have it coming in constantly. So a cactus would have an enormous vacuole just for storing water so it doesn't dry out. So this is sort of comparable to both a refrigerator and a trash can at the same time, because sometimes they can even store waste inside of them if they can't just get rid of it all the time. Chloroplast. This one is also pretty much plant specific. So like the vacuole, you will not really find these in animal cells like yours and mine. But the chloroplast is what helps the plant perform photosynthesis. So you have this solar panel, for lack of a better term or analogy, that captures energy from the sun and converts that into chemical energy. So plants, through a chemical reaction, basically make sugar using energy from the sun, water, and carbon dioxide. And that photosynthesis process is all powered by these little green chemical structures inside of here. This is what literally makes plants green. If it weren't for chloroplast, plants really wouldn't even be green. And then lysosomes. Almost done here. The lysosome is sort of the recycling center, because what its job is, largely in animal cells, is that it dissolves, breaks down, and breaks apart all of the materials of, say, old, broken down, no longer functioning organelles, or large food particles that aren't ready to be digested, waste products that need to just get recycled into new usable materials. So the lysosome is responsible for basically dissolving and breaking apart material. So just as a fun note to go out on, your body has all of those little parts, minus the ones that are plant cell specific, in about 100 trillion different cells. That's a lot of nuclei, a lot of Golgi apparatuses. You get the idea. Your body, as a combination of cells, you have 100 trillion cells that collect into tissues, organs, organ systems to ultimately make up you. All right, thanks for watching.